I want to welcome all of you for this important conversation on legacy and mission, theological education and the history of slavery. This conference is one of many events that we've held throughout the year to discuss the findings of the historical audit report and to discern faithful ways to maintain a community of faith and learning.
So this conference is one part of a whole range of initiatives inspired by the PTS slavery audit and thinking about what we're going to do to be stronger and better and different. It uncovers narratives that were forgotten or suppressed from the 19th century, but also into the 20th century, with an aim, as Dr. Barnes said, of telling the truth, because truth is in order to goodness.
One of the things I think that William and Mary has certainly learned is that you can do this work and it's a good thing. There's nothing to be afraid of. I think there's a fear that if we admit that we own slaves, or if we admit that we participated in Jim Crow activities, then no one's going to come to our university, I guess. I don't know. But that's not the case. I make it a habit of when I speak to folks to ask them, students in particular, if you had known this about William and Mary before you came, would you have decided to go somewhere else? And I've never had a student say yes to me. Many of them have said, well, I'm glad William and Mary is doing this. I'm glad I'm at a school that's taking this on. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest things that are points that William and Mary has learned. Also, about a year ago this month, William and Mary actually finally did make an apology and use the word apology. But what we are responsible for now is what we do with this information. Amen. When you know more, you do more. You do better. And I think that's what we have to remember. There's no reason for anyone to feel guilty unless you know this information and you don't do anything about it.
Georgetown was built on the backs of enslaved people. It was founded by a Catholic elite that really owed its wealth and power and prestige to slavery. So in 1838, the leadership of the Maryland Jesuits, which was also the leadership of Georgetown College, sold nearly 300 enslaved men, women, and children to two planters in Louisiana. They sold them for $115,000, which is about $3 million in today's money. There was an initial down payment of $25,000 upon the execution of the sale in 1838, and the Jesuits turned around and loaned that money to the college to pull the college out of debt. So that is why I say that I might not be standing in front of you today as a professor at Georgetown, because there might not be a Georgetown if it had not been for this decision in 1838. And if you can understand how the Jesuits could baptize their slaves one day and sell them the next, then you understand the history of American slavery.
The goal of our project at Princeton University is simply stated. The mission of the Princeton and Slavery Project is to thoroughly document the university's historical connections to the institution of slavery and to bring its research and public programming to the broadest possible audience to promote reflection and conversation. Early Princeton students, all of whom lived and studied in Nassau Hall, which you all know, lived in what I would call a landscape of slavery. Behind Nassau Hall sat a farm that was worked by enslaved laborers. Enslaved laborers delivered wood to the college rooms. Enslaved people worked on Nassau Street. And enslaved people, up until at least 1822, lived in the President's House, which for about half a century was the only other building on our campus besides Nassau Hall. We learned that we really were, as the old saying goes, the southernmost ivy. Because during the early Republic and antebellum eras, some 40% of our students came from the South. The comparable figures at Harvard and Yale are about 9 or 10%. At some moments, some 60% of our students came from the South. And there are multiple consequences of this. One consequence, the violence that erupted in this town in the 1830s and 40s as students from slave-holding families encountered free people of color who lived in the town of Princeton.
The overall point of my remarks that I want to keep before you is that all this institutional work might helpfully be seen as itself part of abolitionist struggle. As such, our formation of the current institutional work we're doing needs to be as broad and at points as revolutionary as was abolition. None of us, especially in higher education, theological or otherwise, is free from entanglement in the web that slavery and white supremacy have spun. I think our institutional work of truth-telling and reconciliation can be seen as belonging to the historical struggle of the enslaved for their own abolition. This might chasten any tendency to congratulate ourselves for turning with new sensitivity to the history of slavery and making reparations, and remind us that we owe a debt to the enslaved and their ancestors who never stopped struggling, who were part of an abolition struggle, and thereby kept the heat on us, even though we could often choose to not feel the heat and not act in accord with it.
Brown Hall may have not been slave quarters, but we do know that the funds used to finance its building were donated by individuals whose profits had been derived from the chattel slavery industry. I begin here because I want to mark the ways that the enterprise of slavery and institutional complicities in it, whether we choose to address it or not, haunts us. I'm interested in not just thinking about slavery, the project that we look back to and said that happened then, I'm not responsible. I'm interested in thinking through its afterlife. We are living in its wake, in its afterlife. So to talk about contemporary issues of criminalization, of imperialism, of any sort of form of institutional violence is therefore to talk about the rudimentary sort of presence of slavery in our present. Throughout the history of the US, Black people have been expected to forgive. We've been asked to extend charity in advance of the freedom dreams so many Christian leaders preach as manifested realities to be experienced in heaven only. Forget the police shootings and the officers who kill Black people with impunity. Forget the incessant conditions of over-policing, surveillance, and the incarceration in Black communities, whether rural, urban, or suburban. Forget the economic policies and systems that continue to disenfranchise Black people. Forget housing markets established to diminish Black home ownership and economic well-being. Urban renewal policies set to keep Black people locked within ghettoized land zones. Gentrification, voter suppression, educational inequity, white racists marching under the banner of the Confederate flags on southern streets, and sitting white racist president who called Black nations shithole countries while refusing to call white nationalists racist, the afterlife of slavery.
And slavery is not easily forgotten, nor should it be, right? Especially when considering the Black body. You know the story of the Middle Passage, enslaved Black bodies moaning through each racked body, lament, dancing and swaying in the belly of the slave ships. Right? Africans upon their arrival in the new land were reborn as property, not humanity. It's been called corporeal terrorism because American slavery unleashed an all-out assault on the Black body, right? Being deemed non-bodies, non-beings, chattel, sold at auction blocks, dehumanized, dishonored. And so even at the auction block, one can say that they were possessions whom at the liturgy of the auction block were nothing but a body, a raw material, a zombie made by powerful acts. And so their humanity was erased while their bodies were wounded, sometimes wearing rope neckties. Black bodies were deemed worthless. Even if we think about how they were physically marked through branding, a sign of possession, and whip scarring, which was a sign of punishment. These were the signatures of slavery, right? Scarring the Black body as repulsive, or what Emily Towns calls the grim aesthetic of Blackness. Theological schools need to more fully embrace people and faculty from spirit traditions and offer classes on the spirit without shame and fear. For a spiritless curriculum will be death for the future of the church. I remember when I was a seminary student that a professor introduced me to a visitor by saying, Luke's a Pentecostal, but a smart Pentecostal. The old stereotypes about who's in and who's out theologically, who's acceptable and valid, must be let go. Because we ought not to be fooled if we take Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones seriously. Skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. No breath in them, no spirit in them. If we aren't careful, this is what our theological institutions will look like. Christian zombies, looking pristine and privileged like Princeton, and well put together on the outside, but at its core, at its heart, in its curriculum, there's no breath, no spirit, no life, just death. So I would urge theological schools to get their curriculum baptized in the Spirit.